looking at Genesis, and I told you that as we look at the chapters we've looked at so far, we see kind of a progress. We're going to see a progression, and today we're going to hit rock bottom in terms of humanity doing its thing. Before we get there, we want to remember we've got stories, two different strains kind of blending together, at least two. You've got more if you look at take a broader view. We haven't seen another strain yet. We will when we get into Abraham, because you have another
family.
Yeah, exactly. And another storyteller, group of storytellers that we'll see when we get into the Abraham story that has a slightly different view of God. But we've got these two stories that have sort of intersected and blended and stood apart and moved together. One where God is called God and tends to be less personal, still communicates, but isn't an intimate God, is the one that calls things into being, tends to be very structured, tends to view humanity as the one that's supposed to take care of creation. And that becomes human role. Very interested in getting details. So there's a lot of who is son of whom and who married whom and a lot of that kind of stuff. We see that, and we'll call it the God writer. And then we've seen the Lord, where God is called, the deity is called Lord, those four letters. And that God tends to be, or the way the writer describes God, is far more personal. It's the God that creates Adam out of dirt, and the little mud man makes a little mud man and breathes into him the Holy Spirit, as opposed to calling him into being. So you've got this God that is more intimate. He walks, he talks, directly to people. He encounters things. It's a more personal. And we saw those stories. And when we look at the Lord stories, we've got Adam and Eve as a Lord story, not really a God story. Because God is the chapter 1 creator, and he created humanity. Male and female, he created them. But we've got Adam and Eve in this Lord story. And Adam and Eve in the garden, what ends up happening with Adam and Eve?
They
disobey God. What are the consequences? You can't be innocent anymore. You can't live in the garden anymore. You got to go. And life becomes a little harder than it was before. But there's a sign of grace, right? And what becomes a little sign of grace in the Adam and Eve story? What does God end up doing for Adam and Eve that God didn't need to do?
Well, he made them clothes.
He made them clothes. He made them clothes. And God didn't need to do that. I mean, they made the choice, and they ended up feeling shame because of their choice. They lost their innocence. But God is still going to be with them, and he makes them clothes. They have two boys, Cain and Abel. What happens with Cain and Abel? One kills the other out of jealousy. And what's the consequence? Cain kills his brother Abel. What's the consequence? He is given, the world is going to be a harder place. You think it was hard for your dad? It's going to be really hard for you. This is going to be a tough life you're going to live. But there's a sign of grace. What's the little sign of grace? The mark. God puts a mark on Canaan, so that if somebody messes with Canaan, they're messing with God. And so God gives Cain protection. So we've got these two stories, and I think there's a descent here. And again, still grounded in this, human beings are making the choice, good versus evil. They're choosing. And what they tend to do is they tend to choose
evil.
Yes, evil. That seems to be the pattern that we find. And then we looked at last week the Noah story, and the Noah story is kind of interesting because we've got a blending of the God stories and the Lord stories. What happens in the story of Noah?
He ends up building a ship.
Okay, he ends up building a boat, an ark. And we've got two different strains. One, because all creation is horrible, and so God is going to remove his protection And what's going to happen?
Flood.
A flood. Chaos is going to be released onto this creation he made, and because all creation is bad, according to the God writer. According to the Lord writer, who's bad? Human beings are bad.
Yeah.
Human beings are bad, and since, according to that story, everything else that was made for human beings. Therefore, if human beings are not here, the rest of it's irrelevant. So it's a different, you get to the same place, you're just getting there a different route. And so we've got this flood story, right? So we've got humanity, and he talks about humanity being horrible, even God, around God, the Nephilim are horrible, because they're mating with human women and producing giants and stuff. So it's everything. Creation is bad. It's just gotten bad. So God releases the chaos, and understand, God isn't doing anything other than, by these stories, than just removing protection. So God isn't causing it to rain. He's allowing it, removing the protection, so chaos reasserts itself. God is maintaining the bubble, and once he says, I'm not going to do it anymore, chaos reestablishes. So it's not that God is sending lightning bolts down to get people. He's just saying, go for it. Now, we studied Romans. When you look at what Paul writes in the first chapter of Romans, if you remember, one of the consequences of human sin, the fact that human beings, again, these wonderful Genesis images, have chosen to worship the creature rather than the creator, God's wrath, God's anger is shown not by him punishing them, because he doesn't punish humanity for making that choice. What does God do? He lets it do it. He lets humanity do it. In other words, God doesn't protect us from ourselves. We end up paying the consequences of our action. And for Paul, that's broken relationship with God, with nature, and with one another. And that's the same sort of thing we see with the Noah story. It's not that God is causing this to happen. He's just removing his protection, and it occurs.
That's kind of like in Job too.
Job, because he allows Satan to do it. Yeah, Job's that's an interesting story. That's the
one I got.
That's anybody who reads Job and says, "Oh, I feel comfortable. I like that." Boy, you're not reading it. It's uncomfortable on a lot of levels. But yeah, that's right. It's not that God is actively punishing. He's just really removing his protection. And so we've got human action, consequences. But we got a sign of grace again. And what is a little sign of grace? A tiny little boat floating on the chaos. A tiny little boat floating on the chaos becomes a sign of grace. So God hasn't withdrawn that. And as this little boat floats, the chaos has exerted itself. Everything is wiped out. Eventually, we have, the flood stops. And what we saw last time, and this was part of the Lord's story, what happens when the waters recede?
They go out of the
Yeah.
boat, and they replenish the earth and grow crops.
Right? They get out of the boat, and they have a sacrifice. They build an altar, and they have a sacrifice. Lucky that, and this is a Lord's story, lucky that according to the Lord's story, they took 7 pairs of clean animals. So they had animals to sacrifice.
Poor things.
Because if we did the God story and there's only 2 of each kind, we got a problem.
Yeah.
We're not going to have any sheep anymore, because they're going to be gone. Yeah. So they make these sacrifices, and how does God respond?
He makes a covenant.
He makes a covenant with them. And the odor is pleasing to the Lord.
Barbecue is.
Yes, as we all know, barbecue is always tasty. And there's nothing like charcoal. So it's, we've got the odor is pleasing. God regrets, because this is a Lord's story. So that he's done it because God seems to have more human emotions. Early story, one of the things you see whenever, not just with Christianity and Judaism, but with all religions, one of the things you tend to see is as the religion ages, the gods they worship become less personal, become more and more distant. When you look at ancient stories, gods are always hanging out with people. As time progresses, the gods become more and more distant. And that's what we see when you compare the Lord stories and the God stories. Very personal God, and then less than personal, And there's another strain in between where God still talks, but it's usually through visions and dreams. Okay, so we've got this covenant made, Lord covenant made. I'm not going to do this anymore. I've made a covenant with you. We're not going to destroy the world anymore. Now, with order. So anyway, we got this and order with the chaos. I'm not going to remove my protection. And since he didn't he didn't send water down, he just removed. I'm not going to do that again. I'm not going to let chaos reestablish itself in my creation. That's not what I'm going to do anymore. Now, we're kind of in we're in the Noah story when we, and what chapter are we in? 9. When we're in chapter 9, we're still in the Noah story, but I want you to notice we shift the source of the story, because at the end of the Noah story that we looked at in chapter 8, these were Lord stories, and the Lord and the sacrifice and the covenant he makes. Now the writer, and remember we've got, almost a compiler, the one who organizes the material, has chosen to go back to the God story, that God strain of the Noah story. Instead of keeping those two together, he kind of blends them. And what happens in the beginning of chapter 1?
God blesses.
Okay, God blesses Son, which we've already done that. Been there, got the t-shirt. This is something we've already seen, right? And what does he say? What does God say to Noah? Be fruitful and multiply. Gee, I'm experiencing deja vu all over again. We've already been there. We've already heard that. Again, going back to chapter 1, because that's what he said in chapter 1. Be fruitful and multiply. And what as he's having this conversation with humanity, things in this new order, and it's not really a new creation because he's preserved that creation. So he isn't making it new. He isn't calling it into being. But the structure's a little bit different. Still, there's a structure. What's the first thing that's changing now from the original creation?
Vegetarians that can eat meat.
Well, even before, you're right, but even before the food, what does he say? What does he say in verse 2 that's a major change?
The animals now have to be feared.
Now you're going to have fear and dread. The animals are going to be afraid of him. And it's not just some animals, it's
Birds.
All
every animal. So there's going to be a gap now between you and the rest of creation. Because remember in chapter 1, humanity was just at the end. And although humanity had dominion over creation, it was more as a steward to act in God's name. Now the animals, there's going to be a gap because the animals are going to be afraid of you. It's not going to be the same. And now the second thing is
They're not vegetarians.
They're not vegetarians anymore. They are now given permission to eat flesh. Now they can eat flesh. Which is kind of interesting because, when it said Abel, way back in the Abel story, Abel was a shepherd. Well, why the heck would you be a shepherd if you can't, I guess you could share them, but it becomes, that's why we look at them as stories instead of an attempt at some sort of historical development. But now you can eat flesh. This is part of the Noah covenant, the Noahic covenant, that humanity can now eat flesh with an asterisk.
No red blood.
You can't eat meat.
There's still blood in it.
With blood in it. And why can't you eat
where the
meat
life
with blood
is.
in it? Because that's where the life is. That's according to this God story, that's where the life is. Now, we already, the people who heard this read out loud, this story read out loud, already knew that the life was in the blood. How did they already know that the life was in the blood?
Because Cain killed Abel.
When did they find out? Now remember, listen to what I said. The people who are hearing this story,
Okay.
why did they know already that they shouldn't eat meat with blood in it? Because blood was life. Where do we find in the Old Testament that we shouldn't eat meat with blood in it?
In Leviticus.
In Leviticus. We find it in the law. The law tells the Jewish people, you can't do this because life is in the blood. And again, we've talked about that before. The writer of this story is doing what to that command that Moses translated?
Reinforcing.
He is reinforcing it, pushing it all the way back to almost prehistory. So this isn't something that God just made up his mind with Moses. This has roots
Back to Noah.
all the way back to Noah. That you cannot eat meat with blood in it. And I'll tell you, that's huge for Jews. That's a big deal for Jews. So big, and it continued to be a big deal, that when you look at the Apostolic Council in Jerusalem in the 14th chapter of Acts, when they're debating whether Christians needed to be circumcised or not. And that was the only controversy in the early church according to Acts. Because circumcision is a sign of being a Jew. I mean, that's the sign of Judaism. At this conference, they say, no, if you're a Gentile, you don't need to become a Jew by being circumcised, with an asterisk.
Because of the blood.
But you can't eat meat with blood in it. You gotta keep kosher. You cannot eat meat with blood in it. And the Apostle Paul, according to Acts, said, okay, sounds good to me. And so it continued to be not only a big deal to Jews, but Jewish Christians at the end of the first century. It was big enough that they said, you can, Lord have mercy, you don't have to be circumcised, but you can't eat blood because blood has life. And so it becomes a huge, huge deal. But they ground it into this story. This story. Now, again, we've got a covenant. What is God doing that he did in chapter 1? He's doing the same thing he did in chapter 1, isn't he? What's he doing?
Protection.
He's giving them protection. What else is he doing? What is he doing in this covenant he's making with them?
Establishing rules.
He's establishing rules. He's giving them structure, order, which is what the God in chapter 1 does. He creates order out of
He did.
chaos. So there's order there out of chaos. And again, gives them the same command again in case they forgot. You got to do what? You got to get busy. You got to be fruitful and you got to multiply. Because there ain't many of you and there's a lot of empty space, right? So you got to be fruitful and multiply. And so what does God end up establishing with Noah and his sons? And remember, this is going back forever. This is going to continue to be enforced. I am establishing my covenant with you. And a covenant is a deal, promise, contract. And if I've watched enough Judge Judy to know that if you don't have both sides doing something, you don't have a contract.
That's right.
Contract doesn't exist. If I say, you got to pay me $50.
And you say, yeah.
I'm not going to give you anything, but you got to pay me $50. You don't have a contract. There's got to be what's called consideration on both sides. And that's what he makes. He makes a contract that in exchange for you following the structure I've established, what's my part of the contract?
To not destroy the earth again.
I am not going to destroy the earth again. To whom does he make that promise?
Abraham, Noah and his sons,
Who else?
probably the animals.
He does. He makes it with all of creation. This is his covenant with creation. And again, makes sense in chapter 1 because humanity, even though creation, animals are going to be afraid of humans, they're still, humanity, creation, humans have a responsibility within creation. They aren't independent agents, running around. So this is a covenant that God is making not just with people, but also making with every living thing. Different than the covenant we saw in the last chapter that was made with Noah and his sons. Because creation in the Lord's stories is sort of supports humanity. This one, humanity is part of creation. And what does God do as a sign? He gives a rainbow. And it's kind of interesting because when he says a bow, to what is that referring? Now, we see it in English. Oh, come here, girl. We see it in English. What is a rainbow? We know what a rainbow
That's
is.
the problem,
But
to show anytime that there was the clouds and there was rain.
well, why does he choose these words
Because
that we translate as a rainbow?
Water
It's a
is
physical sign.
Right.
split. The light splits going through the water.
Right.
So it makes,
So it's interesting that it's put in the sky
It's in the
because
sky.
the sky is, according to chapter 1, the sky is sort of it's solid. The sky isn't, you just go on forever. In chapter 1, the sky is solid. The sky separates the waters. The sky is the top of the dome. Have you ever seen The Truman Show? Have you ever seen The Truman Show? Oh, with Jim Carrey? Kind of cute. They create, and it's really for him, they create underneath the dome, a television series underneath this huge dome, and he's raised. He's the only one that knows it's not real. Everybody else in it are actors. But the show is, and people tune in and off, it's on 24/7, and they tune in to watch him grow up and live his life. But everybody he encounters are actors. But he's living under this big dome. And he never leaves this little town. He stays in this little tiny town. Until at the end he decides there must be something, why can't I travel? And he ends up going to the edge, and it's a wall painted blue. He hits a wall, and in it there's a door, because you have to come in, actors and actresses come in, and he goes through the door to the rest of the world, a world he's never seen. That's kind of what we're talking about here. That's how they saw the sky, as the top of a dome. That's why he said, open the windows of the sky, and it rains. That's what we've got here. So God is putting this in the sky, as an indication that my dome is going to continue to be maintained. This. But why does he choose to use the word bow? Because it's not a bow, like a bow tie.
it's an arc.
Yeah. If you look at the Hebrew word, it's translated really well in the English. If I used outside of this context and said, Van, have you ever used a bow? Have you used a bow? When did you use a bow?
Since I was a little kid.
Since you were a little kid. And what did you do with your bow?
Kill stuff.
Shot things, right? That's what you use a bow for. You hunt. That's the word in Hebrew. So the rainbow, we think of rainbow as, in the sky. But the word here is a weapon of war, is a weapon, hunting or war weapon. God uses this image, or the writer here uses this image in the sky, this war image, as a sign of peace, of promise. Not of violence, but rather of stability, comfort. So it's a tiny little irony in here that in this story, God chooses to use something that by its nature is violent, because that's what you do with it. You hunt with it, you fight with it, you have wars with it. It becomes a symbol of his continued protection. Protection becomes his symbol of protection.
But don't you find it interesting that it's the light passing through water that makes the colors? Light
Yeah.
going through chaos.
Yeah, that becomes really interesting. That becomes an interesting thing.
Now you ruined my whole thing about rainbows.
Well, well,
Joy out of that.
well then let me add to it. God also envisioned, I think, a little leprechaun at the end of it with a pot of gold.
Yeah.
That's. But they didn't write that. That got edited out.
Yeah.
You know, the pot of gold at the
Well,
at
that's
the end.
because they were Irish.
That's right. And what do the Irish have to do with God? That was rather harsh.
Yeah, that was very hard. Wait a minute, I'm married.
Yeah, that was very harsh. My grandfather was an old Scot, and so Scots tended to have. They would tell Irish jokes. Yeah, they would tell. So I'm not.
I'm half Stewart, so what?
Well, Stuart, that's a good thing. Yeah, then you would appreciate. I was afraid you were an O'Brien, because he used to tell.
Cloud and McHenry.
Well, I remember very clear he would tell Irish jokes, and one of the, I don't remember any of them, but one about did you hear about the Irishman that got water skis for Christmas?
No.
He spent the entire year looking for a lake with a slope.
Oh my God.
Yeah. So there you go.
Looking for a slope.
Looking for a lake with a slope. All right.
Irish people.
Yes, that's probably not a good strategic move. But anyway, so what we've got is this symbol becomes, and we've got it looks like a bow. It looks like a bow in the sky. Okay. So and how does what does the writer hear? And so we've got this covenant established twice, and we're going to see that again because we're going to have the covenant with Abraham established a whole bunch of times later. So it depends on the strain of the story, and clearly the ones who are organizing this understand that the covenant has been established twice. They believe, evidently, they must believe both of them are so important that we need to include them both. Instead of saying, well, this one is the one I'll include and not the other one. But this is the one because we got it established twice. Okay,
Don't you think it might be because it's so important?
well, I think so.
You keep repeating.
Yeah, but they don't sort of wear it down and it becomes kind of a blend of the two. They both are very distinct and very consistent with what the stories would lead us to. It's interesting how they've shaped this. They're called redactors. A redactor is one who puts together works into one, pieces into one work, and that's what they're doing here in Genesis. They're putting together pieces into one story. Okay, and then he tells us a little bit about Noah and his sons, that he's got what? In verse 18, so he's made this covenant. We got sons, right? Who were the sons?
Shem and Ham. How do you say that other one?
Japheth.
Huh?
Japheth.
Jeff.
And Ham is the father of Canaan. Now it's kind of interesting.
Big.
Yeah, well, that's right. Ham was the first one that smoked. But Canaan is. Yeah, I'm cooking now.
You walked in the door.
We're cooking now. We're cooking. Canaan in these stories Canaan is an interesting figure because sometimes he seems to be Noah's grandson, and sometimes he seems to be Noah's son, which would tell us that we're calling on different strains of stories. Okay, so we've got these sons, all the sons of Noah. Now, what in verse 20? What do we know about Noah?
That he's a man of the soil.
He's a man of the soil. Where did that come from? Is this something we knew?
Well, everybody.
Heck no.
worked in the soil.
Well, not only was he the birth of the soil, he was what?
Farm.
The first one to create a vineyard. Okay, so this is this is a new story. Doesn't seem connected to what came before, right? This is something brand new. Doesn't talk about, well, they had to go on the land and they built houses and huts and had to deal with the rock monsters that were walking around. I'm looking at the movie.
Yeah.
They had to settle and build. Well, all of a sudden, boom, Noah's a man of the soil and he grows a vineyard.
And he makes rules to that vineyard.
Oh my goodness gracious.
And look at all the trouble it caused this year.
So now, the fact that he grows a vineyard, when you look at, again, when we look at these things, because we're talking about how do we deal with these stories. How did, in the Old Testament, how do they tend to be viewed? How are vineyards?
That's wealth.
Good.
Well, they tend to be positive images.
Yeah.
The God's vineyard is always a positive, even in the New Testament. Vineyards are viewed as good. Other things maybe as bad or just neutral, but vineyards tend to be a positive image.
If you could make a vineyard and you had the other stuff covered.
Well, they become signs of blessing. That a sign of God's blessing is living in his vineyard. That somehow that creates the idea of abundance. Well, Noah, so we've got this positive image rooted in Noah, and Noah plants this vineyard, right? And what does Noah do with his vineyard because he's a human being?
He's drunk.
He immediately grows a vineyard and instead of just eating grapes,
He makes wine.
he makes wine.
I want to know how they figured this stuff out.
Making wine?
Yeah.
Well, one of the things that's really interesting.
You have to stomp it.
Well, one of the things that's really interesting, because it's so much of what we see in the ancient world, especially in the Mediterranean world, is you got no refrigeration. So things are
fermentation.
things get warm. Fermentation is something that happens naturally and something you want to happen naturally. Because if you put a whole bunch of grapes in a boat and send it across to another port on the Mediterranean, what is that boat full of grapes going to look like? It's going to be nasty. It is going to be one nasty boat. But
You send it with a can.
if you ferment it and turn it into wine, and all of a sudden you can ship it. And so in the ancient world, we've got the same thing with olives and turning it into oil. Makes a lot of sense because you put a bunch of olives on a boat, it ain't going to be worth anything. You turn it into oil, and all of a sudden you can preserve it a little better without refrigeration. So much of the ancient world is grounded. That's why salt is such a wonderful, positive image. Is grounded in this lack of refrigeration. Things that help you are good. So wine is good.
My sister made grape juices fall out of their grapes, and it turned really. Her husband just loved it.
That's like
She was going to throw it away, and Ken says, "Oh no, you won't."
anybody who's made cider. That's what ends up happening. So he makes great. So wine is something. That's why it's always a positive image, because agriculturally that's good. You can preserve grapes by turning into wine. You can't by keeping them grapes. Okay, so here he is. Though he makes wine, he gets drunk.
He abuses.
Immediately. He immediately gets drunk. And of course, as every person who's drunk knows, what does he do?
Stupid.
He takes off all his clothes and stretches out in his.
Why?
in his
That's the
tent.
thing that got me when I was reading it. His son saw him and immediately backed out and went to his brother, and they went in backwards to cover him up. Why was that so bad?
Let's look at that. So Noah, and again, the writer is telling us this. So he's not making any kind of judgment, any kind of judgment. But Noah is laying buck naked, or as we would say, naked, in his tent, right? And Ham, his son, that's right, father of
Canaan.
Canaan. Okay, makes two mistakes. what are the two mistakes Ham makes?
Walks in and sees his son
He
naked.
walks in on his father.
He saw his father's nakedness. And,
He blabbed about it.
and he blabbed about it. Now understand, one of the things that's important is that Jews, even ancient Jews, but Jews in the first century, are really sensitive about exposing their bodies. That's why, right at the beginning in the Lord's story, of Cain and of Adam and Eve, the very first thing that when their eyes were open, they saw that they were naked. And that caused them to say, shame. I mean, it didn't cause them to say, huh? It caused them to say, ooh. And so they immediately wanted to cover up. And that's kind of what the way the Jews were. And so that's a strain, and part of Jewish morality is to stay covered up. In fact,
He got so mad though when he awoke and
Well-
realized that they had,
well, remember, these are the same people that in much later in their history, when the Greeks are ruling Palestine, they want to put one of the things that causes the Maccabean rebellion is, one, they want to put Jupiter in the temple, which really ticks them off, or put Zeus in the temple, which really did not Jupiter. Zeus in the temple makes them mad. But also wanted to put a bathhouse in a gymnasium in Jerusalem. And that's something you didn't do because you got to be naked in a bathhouse. And Jews are really sensitive. One of the things Pilate did, and the reason Pilate, as he's portrayed in the Gospels, he was more of a jerk. He really was. One of the things he did, not only did he march into Jerusalem with the Roman eagles, which the Jews saw as graven images, but he would put his soldiers on the wall of the city, and he'd order them not to wear underwear. And so when the Jews looked up, they saw the moon all the time. They saw a lot of moons all the time. And he only did it to sort of tick the Jews off. Because the Jews, that was something that they were really sensitive about the human body. Like I said, that's why in Genesis, in the story of Adam and Eve, that's the first sign of sin. They're saying this sensitivity goes all the way back to creation, the earliest form of creation. So we should feel shame. The Jews, that's just kind of what the Jews
They're
were.
allowed to undress, but they're to go and multiply.
Yeah. That's kind of a contradiction there, isn't it? But so the fact that he would look at his father's nakedness, that's a bad thing to do, right? That's for a Jew that would be bad.
but he didn't know when he went into the tent that his father was naked.
Well, yeah, but he looked at it,
How could you help it?
How many times has that happened to me? Never. But his second mistake is talking about it, right? And what he could have done is what the other sons do. And what do the other sons do?
Covers.
Yeah, but they won't even look at it. They go in backwards. And this is. They're tripping over things and as they're trying to cover. So they're walking backwards and they cover him up. Now, when Noah awoke, in other words, when he sobered up, thank you very much. When he sobered up, what does the writer tell us?
He was upset.
He knew. How did he know? Don't know, don't care. Writer didn't tell us. So it's not like, the writers say, oh, the other sons went and told on they don't know. Just all we need to know is he knew.
In other words, he never should have said anything at all and just let him sleep it off.
He did both. Both are wrong. Mm-hmm. But again, what we're doing here is we're trying to establish these stories are being told to people who are living, even in their perspective of time, thousands of years, they're living in a very specific situation, time in world history. I mean, that's when they're living, where they have people who are called Canaanites running around. And are Canaanites good?
Not in
Heck no, not later when they enter the promised land and they're constantly fighting Canaanites, because Canaanites are, you wouldn't want your daughter to marry a Canaanite, because they're just no good.
Well, they were taking the land.
Well, they're no good. Yeah, well, yeah,
But
Jews kind of got back at them by killing them all. But that's all par for the course. But Canaanite. So what they're doing is they're establishing these relationships that the people who are hearing the stories consider modern. They're establishing it back into this prehistory. Daddy.
Giving them credence
Yes.
to what they believe.
Yes, Daddy, why do you keep on saying Canaanites are no good? Well, let me tell you the story of Noah. And that's really what we're talking about. Let me tell you the story of Noah. This is why Canaanites are no good.
He cursed us.
Yes, he ends up cursing Ham, but he really lays into who? Canaan, poor Canaan. Canaan is going to be a mess, And who's going to come out ahead in this? Shem is going to come out of Japheth, is going to live in the land, but Lord have mercy. Canaan is going to be the slave to
Shem.
Is going to be the slave to both, right? Mm-hmm. Shem is going to be the father of the Jews. Mm-hmm. And Japheth is going to be the father of those who live in the land with the Jews. But Canaan is going to be the scum of the
lowest of the
earth.
slaves.
Well, now think in the New Testament. Not as the story is told in Mark, but as it's told in Matthew. Jesus encounters not a Syrophoenician woman, but in Matthew she encounters a Canaanite woman. So this idea of Canaanites, the descendants of Cain, being lowlifes, Matthew is calling that out and using it in this story that he shapes, even changing Mark's from Syrophoenician, which is an ethnic designation, to Canaanite, tied to this. He ties it to this story. Matthew's tying it to this story. Okay, so now we know why Canaanites are so rotten, right? So don't, if you see a Canaanite, Patty, if you see a Canaanite, if you go into a store and a Canaanite is at the counter, go next door. Leave. Because Canaanite, they'll cheat you. Canaanite will cheat you in a heartbeat.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, that doesn't sound like what Christ taught.
Well, if you could find a Canaanite, we had when I was teaching history, there was we used to talk about there were no Hittites anymore, so it was okay to tell Hittite jokes. You could tell Hittite jokes because there were no more Hittites. You couldn't tell Irish jokes, couldn't tell Polish jokes, but you could tell Hittites. You have a joke about a Hittite? What's your Hittite joke?
Well, who was the shortest man in the Bible?
I don't know who.
Shuhai the Hittite.
Say that again.
Shuhai the Hittite. Second one, Nehemiah.
Oh my God.
Oh, brother. That was just kind of...
Okay. No, don't ever criticize any joke I tell. All right. So we've got this established in chapter 10, and we'll go through chapter 10 in great detail. Lord have mercy. What is going on in chapter 10?
Genealogy.
You got name, boring. Word of God is boring. Oh, yes. This is what tells us who wrote it, though. It's these being counters that love to have detail. There are some kind of interesting things thrown in, like Nimrod. And Nimrod, how is Nimrod described? He's a mighty hunter, mighty warrior. So Nimrod was. It's really interesting though, and these are the descendants of Ham, right? And the descendants of Ham aren't real good, right? And gosh, Cush is a descendant of Ham, and
The father of the
Egypt is a descendant of Ham. And you look at what they built, the cities Nimrod built. He went to Assyria and built Nineveh. Kind of interesting. These were the great enemies of Israel, and they are all going to be, the great enemies of Israel are going to be descendants of Ham. So how should we feel about the Egyptians? They're descendants of Ham. Not only are we scared of them, but they are low lives. They aren't worth much. So again, shaping this modern stuff. But the descendants of Shem are the good guys. Okay, so we've got all of this, and they go out and they repopulate the world, and that is great. Okay? Till we get to chapter 11. In chapter 11, we reach our lowest point, because again, we start a new story. And what does the writer of this story tell us right at the beginning?
That everybody spoke the same language.
Everybody speaks the same language. Now we're gonna see that this is coming from the Lord. This is a Lord story, not a God story. This is a Lord story. We'll see it a little later. Everybody speaking the same language, and what do?
Instead of spreading out, they congregate.
Okay, they all they get together, right? They all come and get together, and what do they decide to do?
Make bricks.
Let's make bricks.
A tower up so
High
it can be
dog.
as high as God.
We are going to build a tower.
Tower as high as God.
Yeah. Now, in the ancient world, you look at places where folks worshipped. Where did they worship?
The highest point.
Highest point. They either worshipped on mountains, or if they couldn't worship on a mountain, they would do what? They made them. That's exactly right. They made a mountain. That's what a ziggurat is. Those like a pyramid. It's a pyramid. Where you did your thing on top, you built a mountain, because if you were high, you were
God.
closer to God. And they are going to build a tower. They are going to build this tower of brick, and it is going to
Reach
the heavens. Now, I don't think this is an accident that the writer says this. So they're working. They're working to build this tower. What does the Lord do? The Lord again.
He makes them speak different languages.
Well, even before that. I love it. He came down. Now, understand, these people are saying, we're going to get together. We're going to get a tower, and when we'll build it up to heaven. And when we build this tower, we will be up to heaven. But the writer says, for the Lord to even see the tower, what did he have to do? He had to come down. So humanity isn't going to do it. This is not what they're going to be able to do. It's foolish. But it does show what? Intent and incredible arrogance. Incredible arrogance. That if we build something together, we can reach up to God. We can join God in heaven. And God comes down and sees this tower which mortals are building. And what's his response?
Oh, we can't have that happen.
Lord says, look what's happened. They got one language. It's only going to cause them trouble. It's going to cause them trouble. So what should who do? What should we do? Which means God is talking to who?
Us.
The Lord is talking to God.
What is the Lord talking? Who is the Lord talking to? He's talking, again, this heavenly court. He's talking to his heavenly court, that's the vision that ancient people, that you had the Lord and then he had his court like any other Lord has court. So he has his court around, and he says to his court, we can't let this happen, right? So what are we going to do?
We're making so they don't understand one another.
We are going to go down and make sure that they don't understand one another. And once they don't understand one another, what's going to happen?
They
can't work together. They can't work together. And so what does the Lord do? He confuses the languages, and he spreads them all over the place, right? Spreads them all over the place. Now, And they can't work together anymore. Again, good story. Daddy, why do people speak different languages?
Because we couldn't get.
Because of the Lord. That's all you need to know. Because the Lord. And that's you notice every answer is like either because of the Lord or because of us. And a combination of the two. So that's what the Lord has done. Now, it's really interesting. We had the first story, and all of them are Lord stories. Had the first story of Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve disobey God, right? Decide to choose for themselves good and evil. Consequence?
Nakedness.
Nakedness. Yes, nakedness can't be in the garden. Sign of grace?
He gets them close.
Gives them clothes. Okay. Second story, Cain and Abel.
They kill one.
Cain kills
Abel.
out of jealousy. Takes human life. Consequence?
Mark.
Well,
Mark.
consequence.
We have to lead people.
Life is going to be tough. Really going to be tough. Sign of grace? Mark. Noah story.
He builds a boat.
Human sin?
Erased.
Always. Terrible. Everything. Human beings are just running amok. Awful. And it's affected it's awful. Awful. Consequence? Flood. Sign of grace?
The ark.
Ark. Every single time human beings have screwed up, they paid the consequences. But there's been a sign of grace. There's been a sign of grace explicitly in the story. And then, if you want to push the Noah story even further, you got a covenant made and a rainbow in the sky. So you got several signs of grace in the Noah story. Tower of Babel story. Human beings, and I think as you look at the progression of the Genesis story, and I think the one who's organizing this, I think he's aware of it. As he's looking at it, this is of the four that he's mentioned, human beings doing something terrible towards God or that have divine consequences. This is the worst. What have human beings done here that's even worse than a brother killing his brother? At least in the eyes of the writer.
Trying to get as high as God.
Trying to be God.
Yeah.
Trying to be God. The assumption that we can become God. Mm-hmm. Okay? Consequence of their actions? Confusion, different languages, they can't work together. Divisions. Sign of grace?
That God spreads them out.
Well, is God spreading them out a good thing? Because they can't work together anymore. Sign of grace. Hold that. You don't have that explicit sign of grace. You don't have a rainbow in the sky. You don't have a mark to protect you. You don't have clothes made. You don't have that. We're kind of left with the consequences. Right now we've got humanity wandering around, right? Can't talk to one another, can't work with one another, all kinds of divisions, and whatever hostility develops out of divisions.
Isn't that what Paul said though, that when man gets to a certain point, he'll just let them do what they're going to do and then reap the consequences.
But every other time, that's been the case, that God has said, well, but I'll make them clothes. They should be naked and just have to deal with it. Or Cain should just have to deal with the fact that he ain't going to be able to grow anything. And the people, whenever he walks into town, people are going to try to kill him. And with Noah, Lord have mercy. Maybe Noah needs to stay awake at night, worried about whether I'm going to send a flood again. Because if I get ticked off again, I'm going to send a flood. And I'm going to wipe him out.
But Noah as the father, and to see the division with his sons or grandsons and stuff must have been pretty hard.
Well, of course, when the Tower of Babel is way later, so as they're telling the story. Now, in chapter 11, how does chapter 11 end?
With another genealogy.
We got another genealogy. And this is the genealogy of
The Jews.
Of the Jews, of Shem, the one that's favored, of Noah's son that's favored. And it's a lot of names, right?
Yeah.
Nobody wants to read those names, right? I mean, they're really, really boring.
Except that it's
Unt-
Abram.
Until you
Sarah,
get,
and-
until you get to the end. And as you look at the genealogy and you get to verse 26, the end of the genealogy, who do you have? What do you have at the very end? You have a guy
Abram.
named Abram. And I'll tell you, and what we're going to see in the next chapter, chapter 12, we're going to start the story of Abram, who will become Abraham, because Abram means father, and Abraham is plural, so it means father of a lot, so we've got Abram. And see, I think as the guy who is compiling this and shaping this story, he ends up becoming the sign of grace. The covenant made Abram becomes a sign of grace after the Babel. Babel is the lowest level of humanity. We have reached our lowest level. We assume we can be God, which is what Paul says about idolatry. But that's going to be reversed. That's going to be changed because we've now got Abram. And what is God going to end up ultimately doing through Abram?
Saving the world.
He's going to save the world. The world's going to change because of Abram. And that's why I think that at the end, when you look at Revelation, you've got this recreation. So Revelation, the Bible, and that's why I could do it in 90 minutes, the Bible is full circle. We come back to kind of an Eden image when we look at Revelation, and it's because of Abram. It's going to be because of Abram and his descendants, which will include who? Who's going to be a descendant of Abraham? Jesus is going to be a descendant of Abraham. So that's what we're going to look at next week. But we've got these stories in prehistory that I think are all tied together. Behavior, consequence. Now we're going to look at the sign of God's grace that's going to continue throughout Genesis and I think throughout the rest of the Bible. Okay. Any questions? Tower of Babel. Don't go home and build a tower to reach to God.
I'll tell you what, if I ever tried that, it'd be so stinking crooked, I'd end up,
Well,
I would never make it high enough to do anything.
Don't do it. don't do it. Okay, let's have a word of prayer. Lord God, thank you so much for giving us this time together. Remind us that even though we do stupid things, and we do, and even though we pay the consequences for the stupid things we do, and we do that as well, remind us that you are still present, you are still the Lord, you still love us, and there's still grace. So remind us of that as we go about our living. In the name of Christ we pray. Amen.
Amen.